And on this day, President Uhuru Kenyatta took his oath of office for his second and final term, promising to unite Kenyans in a speech that sounded somewhat of his manifesto and his plans for what he intends to do for the country over the next 5 years. Of course, big on that was, he said, uniting the country. So we'll be taking a look at certain aspects of that speech. And of course, that all comes in the midst of what we saw, a completely different picture on the other side of town. That's at Jacaranda grounds, where Raila Odinga and his NASA supporters attempted to access the grounds but were not allowed to do so. Tear gas rent the air as they had confrontations with the police. Sadly, yet again tonight, on the day that President Uhuru Kenyatta gets into office for his second and final term, another young life lost. 7-year-old Jeffrey Mutinda shot in the chaos and the confrontation between police and NASA supporters. That is the juxtaposition we find ourselves in this country today. We'll be taking a look at President Uhuru Kenyatta's speech, what it means for us, what it means for the country going forward, and just some analysis on that as well. I am joined tonight on the show by Kakai Kissinger, who's a lawyer and a political analyst. Also expecting Javas Bigambo in just a moment to be able to take a look at that. But before we begin, take a look at that historic moment that happened today. President Uhuru Kenyatta taking his oath.
Mr. President, we'll begin with the first oath, which is the oath of allegiance. I'll ask you to lift the Bible with your right hand and place your left hand on the Constitution. Please repeat after me. I,
Uhuru Kenyatta,
in full realization of the high calling I assume as President of the Republic of Kenya,
I assume as President of the Republic of Kenya,
do swear that I will be faithful.
Do swear that I will be faithful
and bear true allegiance to the Republic of Kenya, that I will obey, preserve, protect and defend the Constitution of Kenya,
protect and defend this Constitution of Kenya
as by law established, and all other laws of the Republic, and that I will protect and uphold the sovereignty, integrity, and the dignity of the people of Kenya. So help me God.
So help me God.
That was the moment earlier today. Of course, right after that moment, he then gave his first speech as president officially. We'll get into that now with my panel tonight. Kakai Kissinger, thanks very much for joining us on the show tonight. We'll get into the various aspects of his speech in a moment. But first, I'd just like to hear your thoughts on the overall speech, the message and the tone.
Possible to get some water?
Thank you very much.
Is it possible?
Yes, carry on, Kakai.
Thank you very much, Yvonne, for inviting me to this show. I think the overall speech was expected in the sense that if you followed clearly the events that led to this election, you will be able to tell where or what directions the speech was going to take. Now, if you look at the last 3 days prior to this, the president had a church function, and in that church function, he spoke about some things. And most of the things that he spoke about were hinging on issues of reconciliation and identifying that it's important for Kenyans to move together as one nation or as one people. So that was one of the things that he was pushing for. And as you realize, then it ended up being in the speech for today. Another thing was the issue of the legality or the issues that surround his election into the presidency. So the issues of legality and either political acceptance also came into the speech. So overall, the president took a position whereby the speech was towards healing the nation and promising that since he's our president, and he's not only a president for those who elected him, but he's a president for all Kenyans, he was very clear and keen in terms of ensuring that the country moves together as one people and as one nation.
All right, Kakai, I think we have Javas Bigambo ready now. Javas, what do you think about the speech? Kakai says it was reaching out and it was one of unifying the nation. Do you see it the same way or do you have a different view?
Well, I listened to every word of the president, and one thing is that the president made tremendous effort to try and demonstrate in word and spirit that he's very much willing to unite this nation and heal the wounds that had been caused by the fractures, ruptures, and the injuries of political persuasions, differences, etc. However, of course, there are some limitations that were self-evident in the president's speech. One, for example, beyond the expression that he's going to be the nation's president, including those who voted for him and those who didn't, I think the limitation came through the manner in which the speech was woven. I think the president's speechwriters were able to do much more than they did in terms of being more persuasive to try and reach out to the conscience and the hearts and minds of every citizen. Take note, for example, that the entire nation was not gathered at the Kasarani Stadium today, whether it was physically or even in spirit. The president needed to be persuasive to the extent that even those who did not vote for him, their aspirations, their goals, their understanding of matters governance were things that the president was willing and committed to embrace. And that's not the president's mistake. Actually, that's the mistake of his speechwriters. And moving forward, I think the president will do much more beyond the works of his speech today to demonstrate that he's willing to hold the hands, the minds, and the spirit of every citizen in this country, that we are united as a nation beyond what he spoke about to do with the values that define us as a nation.
And about building bridges. Just to hold that thought for a moment, let's listen to what he actually said about building bridges in the nation.
I undertake today to be the custodian of the dreams of all and to be the keeper of the aspirations of those who voted for me and those who did not. I will be president of all. And I will devote my time and energy to build bridges, to unite and bring prosperity to all Kenyans.
Javas, you were saying?
So you see that the president is expressing himself that he is willing, he's committed, and that he's going to be the president of every citizen in this country, those who voted for him and those who didn't. But remember that there is the skepticism that dogs those who did not vote for him. And there is the feeling amongst those who did not vote for the president that maybe his expression could be only mouth deep. So that is why when you analyze the rhetorical devices that were used in the president's speech, you realize that there is much more in terms of connectivity and weaving that needed to have been done to reach out to calm the spirit of every citizen individually who was listening to the president, whether they were of the opposition or they were of Jubilee.
Okay.
And looking at it that way, you realize that beyond the amalgamation that the president needs to do of this nation, there are various levels or strata that needs to be looked at. One, there is the leadership strata that needs to be looked at in terms of the president reaching out to them. Realize that beyond the attempted persuasion that the president's speech did today, the president needs to demonstrate that he is willing and intended to reach out to the leadership of the other political leaders in this country. And then there is the reaching out to the individual citizens of this country.
So what you're saying is words and action, that the actions that will come subsequently will indeed bring these words to life, if at all? That's what happens? Is that what you're saying?
Well, yes, there is the life, the reality beyond the president's inaugural speech today.
Okay.
But remember too, that there is the fractures and the features that are existing in this country today, political features especially, that have come about due to the political differences that have existed in this country due to the electioneering period.
All right. So I'd like us to talk about that electioneering period. And there was something he said, and we will play that in just a moment, about the inauguration ending the election. And it sounds similar to sentiments he made just before the swearing in, which we all now know, where he said he doesn't watch television anymore because there's a lot of analysis, you know, putting people like yourselves out of business for a moment. But let's listen to President Uhuru. He talked about the inauguration ending the long electioneering period. Let's listen to that and we'll come back and talk about what this means for the tone of political discussion going forward.
Continent's history. Today is the 123rd day since we began on August 8th. Today's inauguration therefore marks the end, and I repeat, the end of our electoral process. The elections are now firmly behind us.
Kakai, what did you think about that? The end and marking the end of the electoral process. If you tie this into when he was talking about, you know, no more discussion of politics, and there's quite a number of people who took offense to that and with respect to the meaning of politics in this country.
I think if you understand what he was meaning is that the president was talking that where we are right now is the end of the electoral process. Remember, we have used words like swearing in ceremony is the icing on the cake. So therefore, it means therefore that at the end of the day, the whole process has now come to an end. And what we are seeing there is the icing on the cake in terms of now laying out the strategies of how he intends to perform the functions of the office of the president and those oaths he took about. Now, there are three things that I think were on his mind. One, that we have had a political contest in the last 1 year in preparation for this election. And this political contest has been so vigorous and so thorough that we found ourselves as a nation going to the Supreme Court twice. So what he's just communicating is now, look, the political contest that now led into the electoral contest and eventually led into the legal process has now come to an end. So now as a nation, we now need to start focusing and move away from the political contest and now go into development. And that's why, Yvonne, when you began the discussion, you talked about the speech, and you realized that the entire of his speech was focused towards his administration, how they will maneuver in terms of leading the country in the next 5 years, and that speech was completely hinged on his manifesto. What then the president was trying to talk about is, look, political contest, we are done. Electoral contest, we are done. Legal contest, we are done. Now let's go into development. Let's go into the manifesto.
Yes, but so where does this leave it? Because he really said that particular statement with finality, you know, that we are done with that process. But yet, Jarvis, we find ourselves in the position where NASA is talking about having dialogue on matters of electoral justice. Was there a subliminal message in that particular statement to NASA regarding talks on fixing our electoral system?
Well, I want to appreciate that the president made a good effort. However, I realized that when the president was making this speech at Kasarani, the other part of the political faction was feuding and making all attempts to meet at Jacaranda grounds today. And that tells you that not every person in this country was believing in the president's goal, vision, and aspiration. And to that extent, we need to look at it from this other perspective or through these lenses, that one, in political communication, speech making is a tool that is supposed to be used, one, for persuasive purposes, to communicate vision and aspirations, but also it needs to be looked at as an adhesive for a nation so that it tries to link those who believed in a particular political leader and those who did not believe in that particular political leader. For example, today when you listen to the president's remarks, beyond the other issues that were all collective about this country, the president could have actually done better in terms of speaking specifically to those who have not believed in him as the leader of this country, who is supposed to lead the country in the next 5 years, and that's why they chose to support the other faction. And the reason why they have still committed and remained steadfast in believing in the other leadership, even when he is legitimately the leader of this country. And when you look at it through those lenses and through that prism, you realize that the president had the opportunity, much as it was not exercised to its maximum potential, to try and speak to that mother, to that father who lost a child in this electioneering period and post-election period, to that individual who believes that the struggle about electoral justice and malpractices is still ongoing, and that's why they were still trying to find their way to Jacaranda grounds. The president did not try to bridge that gap. And that was a missed opportunity in terms of his speech, when you look at it in totality.
All right. We will get to, in just a moment, the specific issues, because like we said at the start of the show, he was laying out his plans and his manifesto and his administrative agenda. We'll get to that, particularly on manufacturing and a number of those other issues. But I want us to listen to what he said regarding the rule of law, because yet again, this was something else that has caused quite some conversation in the country. He was talking about following the rule of law and the number of times that indeed they have worked within the rule of the law. Listen to President Uhuru Kenyatta.
For all. The first one is to muster the courage to embrace our future by freeing ourselves from the baggage of past grievances. And the second is to keep to the rule of law.
Okay, so the rule of law is something that he talked about, and I think he also went on to talk about, the number of times, for example, when they went to the ICC, how they complied with the Supreme Court ruling after the August 8th, saying that whatever our contestations, that the rule of law must abide. The rule of law, Javas, I want to begin with you, and then we will go to Kakai. But even while this was being said, there was chaos again in another part of the country, and again, a young boy lost his life in some senseless violence. Javas? Javas, can you hear me?
Well, I think that the president made a good effort when he spoke to the matters of the rule of law. And appreciate that when you look at Article 10 of the Constitution of Kenya, the rule of law itself is enumerated as one of the values of our nation. And that is a very good thing. However, you realize too that beyond speaking to matters of the rule of law, yes, it's not a question of debate here. Matters of the election were garnered thoroughly when the Supreme Court made its determination on this electoral dispute, when it pronounced itself on the lack of merit of the petitions that were brought before the Supreme Court challenging President Kenyatta's re-election. And appreciating that, it is important too that the other faction that does not and has not brought itself to the realities of the moment, that yes, the Supreme Court pronounced itself, one, and secondly, that by way of the inauguration today, we have substantively by way of law, spirit and letter, have a president in office. It is important that even as NASA pursues the other uncharted waters of reforms in matters to do with challenges to do with our elections, they need to realize that we live within the territory defined by the Constitution as Kenya, and as of now, Kenya has got a president and deputy president in office. They need to bring themselves to that realization without fault.
But they've said they won't recognize him as their president. They say they do not recognize him as their validly elected president.
Well, I know that, for example, there are those hang-ups and limitations and holdbacks, for example, that NASA has. Today, speaking at Jacaranda grounds, or rather going by their misgivings to do with the re-election of President Kenyatta, you realize that the pronouncements of the various NASA leaders, they have expressed clearly, one, that they do not appreciate and embrace the re-election and the being in office or sworn into office of President Kenyatta, but it is now a fact, whether of law and even ontologically, that President Kenyatta is legitimately now in office. But question of legitimacy now arises, which is the other thing. It's a whole stretch, it's a whole prairie that cannot actually be dealt with even within the next 5 years, because that political question of legitimacy will keep on lingering like a hanging cloud that is pregnant of rain. And that is why it's important, moving forward, beyond the inauguration today, to have President Kenyatta speak, reach out in word and deed to every Kenyan to demonstrate that Nyanza region is still a part of the citizens that he's going to lead and govern, to see their pursuit of happiness and prosperity, the parts of the coastal region, etc.
All right, let's hear from Kai.
I think one of the biggest, I listened to that speech very carefully, and one of the biggest achievement, or one of the biggest take-home, was the issue of the rule of law. And there was a reason why the word choice of the word, the rule of law, were used after he took the oath of office. Now, remember that the president took two kinds of oath, and both of those oaths are actually given under the constitutional requirement. It's a constitutional requirement that he has to take those oaths, and in those oaths, he's actually swearing to the Kenyans that he'll ensure that he upholds the rule of law, and that's why there was a constitution there and there was a Bible there. So he swore to the fact that he will ensure that the rule of law is upheld in this country. Now, when he was talking about the issue of the rule of law, he did very fundamental things. And one of the things he did, he was to tie that rule of law together with independence of the institutions. Remember that rule of law is just ensuring that institutions or Kenyans follow the rule of law. And he went into details, saying, look, myself as a president, if you listen to that speech, myself as a president, I have faced challenges of the ICC. I submitted before the ICC, and I came out of the ICC. Myself as the president, I've been faced with issues of questioning about elections. I have gone to the Supreme Court twice seeking for justice in the Supreme Court. And therefore, I realized that then I got my judgment in terms of what it is. So I am telling you Kenyans, in other words he was saying, I'm telling you Kenyans, please let's submit ourselves to the rule of law. That as a country, we must be governed by the rule of law. Because without the rule of law, then you cannot be able to achieve the milestones that he wants to achieve in terms of his government. And being the president, swearing on the Constitution, then I expect him saying that every other individual or every other Kenyan, irrespective of who you are, you must abide by and follow the rule of law. So I think the issue of the rule of law was very well couched in the speech and linked together with the independence of the institutions. And even went further and said how he will want to collaborate and work together with the institutions like judiciary, which is the third arm of government, to enhance the rule of law. So I think that was a very good thing. But the other thing that Jarvis talks about, which I think I must comment about, is the issue of political legitimacy. I think that we will still continue remaining ourselves in a situation whereby we confuse what we are talking about. However, I do understand that the legalities of these issues is settled. What is now remaining is the issue of political legitimacy. But the issues of political legitimacy, remember, all the political questions that arose out of these elections ended up into the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court was able to deal with these political challenges that arose, because these political challenges were now the questions that the Supreme Court was dealing with in terms of what you call in law issues. And out of these issues, it were then framed into the legal questions that were arose. So when we are talking about political legitimacy and legal legitimacy, you need to find a very thin line to understand the difference between that, because most of these issues that are political in nature or political legitimacy issues have already been solved in the legal context in terms of the legal legitimacy. So I think what we now need to understand, Yvonne, before I finish, is that yes, we may have some challenges going forward. And these challenges have already been addressed by the president, saying that, look, we may have challenges. And he even said, we've been in these challenges before. We must try then to overcome them. And I'm willing, and I'm extending an olive branch to my competitors. Remember, we had about 7 or 8 presidential competitors. So Andy said, all of them, please join me. I want to adapt your agendas. I want to adapt your manifesto. I want to improve what I have. So I think that is a good thing in terms of speech writing. That's a good thing in terms of thinking forward. That's a good thing in terms of reconciliation. That's a very good thing in terms of pushing the country ahead.
All right, I want us to take a break, but just before that, I would like just a very brief comment from either of you. We've talked about the rule of law and the independence of institutions. So perhaps, Kaikai, to begin with you, where does this leave statements like we shall revisit the judiciary, like calling them wakoras? Where does that leave that? Because sometimes, you know, there's a bit of an incongruency or inconsistency with the message. And one would note that these sentiments came after the first Supreme Court ruling, which wasn't in his favor, and then after the second one. Now we hear about the rule of law and independence of institutions.
I don't know whether Jarvis can pick it up, then I can pick it up later because I can't hear you.
Okay, all right. We will get to you in just a minute. Jarvis, where does this leave those statements? You know, how do we then pick it up and go? Because we've been in a set of very emotional times. But one hand, it's wakoras and we'll revisit. On the other hand, it's a rule of law.
Well, let us bring ourselves to realities of the moment. One, that after the nullification of the August 8th presidential election, and the pronouncements of the president himself, terming the judiciary or the judges of the Supreme Court as wakoras, it left a very bad taste in the mouth. And remember that the judiciary is one of the arms of government, very equal. And right now, the president himself, today during his inauguration remarks, determined that he is going to work with all arms of government, including the judiciary especially, and that he spoke clearly to the matters of the rule of law. And if you look at the rule of law in its totality, then it also embraces issues of separation of powers, issues to do with appreciation of the place of law in society and governance, issues of accountability, etc. The president may want to demonstrate in act, not in words, moving forward after this inauguration, that actually maybe he may have had a slip of the tongue when he termed the judiciary and the Supreme Court judges as the wakoras. Otherwise, somebody would want to wonder, why is it that this moment round, he seemed to have had his tail in the mouth, at one moment speaking or referring to the judges as the wakoras, at the second time, today during the inauguration, celebrating the judiciary and the rule of law, and actually thanking even the Chief Justice himself and his office in the process that was conducted today. That itself causes or shows a split. And we need to see from the head of state, the head of the executive, who is the president, that actually his appreciation of the rule of law and other institutions that constitute the wholesomeness of government is as bright as the sun and does not dim with the approaching of darkness, to show that actually at some moments he is like the moonlight that is there only when there is darkness. He needs to be the light that shines at all times for the rule of law.
Okay, we want to take a break. We will come back. We have lots more to discuss with the president's speech. We will get into some of the details that he talked about, his plans for the next 5 years of this country. We will get to that in just a moment here on The Big Story tonight, analyzing the president's speech as he took oath of office for his second and final term in office. We'll be right back.